The wind hit first. It came across the open trail like a fist, mean and unforgiving. The sun had bled out over the horizon an hour ago, and the sky was already the color of a day-old bruise, a sickly purple fading into the kind of deep, starless black that swallows sounds. A woman was crouched low between two jagged rocks. Her name was Delaney Grace. Her dress was shredded, her legs were caked in mud, and her hands were pressed tight against the swell of her belly. She didn't cry. Not anymore. The tears had run out somewhere between the second contraction and the moment she finally accepted the ice-cold truth. No one was coming for her. No wagon, no husband, no father, no brother, not even a preacher with hollow words of comfort. She'd been cast out. Unholy. That's what her husband's mother had called her after he died from the fever. "No kin of ours bears bastard breath under our roof," she had spat, her words sharper than any blade. So the girl who once sang soprano in the church choir was now giving birth in the dirt, miles from any soul. Her dress, a pale blue that used to remind her of summer skies, was now soaked through with blood and grime. She leaned her head back against the cold, unfeeling rock, her teeth clenched so hard she could hear them grinding. A low moan escaped her throat, the sound a dying animal makes when it's too tired to keep running. The pain was a relentless tide, crashing over her, breaking her open like a storm breaking a tree. But it was the silence between the waves of agony that truly terrified her. That silence was a living thing. It whispered doubts into her ear. It whimpered questions she couldn't answer. Would she survive this? Would the child even draw a single breath? And if they both died out here, would anyone in the entire world even care? A guttural scream tore from her throat as the final, world-splitting push came. She bore down with every last ounce of strength, with all the fear and fury and hope she had left in her broken body. And then, the world tilted on its axis. There was a sudden, slick warmth, a small, wet weight against her skin, and then a sound that pierced the cold night like a single candle flame in a vast, dark church. A newborn's cry. It was a girl, alive. Delaney collapsed back against the stone, panting, gasping, feeling like she'd just outrun death itself. Her fingers trembled as she reached down, her hands clumsy as she pulled the tiny, wailing infant to her chest. The baby was red-faced, slippery with blood and earth, but she was real. She was here. "Hush now," Delaney whispered, her voice cracking. "Mama's here." Her arms shook uncontrollably, but her heart somehow beat on. She had no knife to cut the umbilical cord, only a sharp shard of flint she'd found near her boot hours ago. She made do. She always had. The wind howled again, colder this time, crueler, as if it had been watching the whole spectacle and was unimpressed. The baby, too weak to nurse, whimpered with tiny, shallow gasps. Delaney clutched her tighter, frantically wrapping her in the only thing she had left, her old shawl, a piece of brown wool, frayed and damp and pathetic. She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, tasting salt and iron and dust. There was no cradle here. No name had been chosen. There was just the frantic, desperate sound of her own heartbeat and the distant, haunting whistle of coyotes calling to each other in the darkness. She sat like that for what felt like an eternity, a woman wedged between cold stone and biting wind, a soul caught between life and death. A fever was already starting to burn through her body, and her legs were numb and useless. She wondered what dying would feel like. Would it be like falling asleep, or would it be like being forgotten? She tried to pray, but the words felt like dust in her mouth. She whispered them anyway. A prayer for strength, a prayer for mourning, a prayer for milk. Her daughter's tiny hand twitched against her chest, as small and fragile as a sparrow's wing. "Stay with me," she whispered into the baby's downy hair. "Please, just stay with me." The baby's eyes remained sealed shut. Delaney leaned her head back, closing her own eyes, and let the vast, empty night wash over her. If this was the end, she thought, at least she had held her child. At least she hadn't died completely alone. But fate, it turned out, was not yet done with her. It came as a sound so faint at first, she thought she was imagining it, the crunch of boots on snow-softened gravel. A rhythm, a steady, approaching footstep. Her eyes snapped open. She stirred, her gaze narrowing toward the trail. A shadow was moving through the darkness, coming down the path. It wasn't a wagon, it wasn't a group of men. It was a single figure on horseback, tall and silent and dark against the bruised sky. For a breathtaking moment, the moon broke through the thick clouds, casting a sliver of silver light onto his shoulders. Apache. The word flared in her mind like a lit match. Every horror story she'd ever heard back in Arkansas, every tale whispered by frightened settlers around a campfire screamed at her. Hide, run, pray. But she couldn't move. She was already on the ground, bleeding and broken and empty. There was nothing left to take. Let him do what he will, she thought, a strange sense of calm settling over her. But the rider didn't reach for the rifle she could see slung across his back. He didn't reach for a knife. He dismounted slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, like a man approaching a wounded, cornered animal. He was massive, standing over her now, a towering silhouette that blocked out the sky. Long black braids fell past his shoulders, tied with simple leather straps. His skin was the color of warm, sun-baked earth, and his eyes were the color of amber. They were not cruel, they were just watching. He took in the whole scene, the blood, the torn dress, the shivering infant, without a single flicker of emotion. Delaney swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She lifted her chin just a fraction of an inch, a tiny, pathetic act of defiance. Do what you must, the gesture said, but don't you dare see me as weak. The baby stirred then, letting out a soft, pitiful whimper. The man's gaze flicked down to the child, then back to her face. For a long moment, he just stood there. Then, slowly, he knelt. He reached inside his heavy buffalo hide coat and withdrew a waterskin. Wordlessly, he offered it to her. Delaney hesitated, her own hand trembling so badly she could barely raise it. But she took it. She drank. The cold, clean water hit her dry, cracked throat, like a mercy she didn't know how to receive. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months. He still hadn't spoken a word. The man looked at the infant again, shivering in its thin, damp shawl. He turned back to his horse, pulled a soft, thick pelt from his saddle pack, a mountain lion's fur, perfectly kept and impossibly warm. He held it out to her. Delaney just stared at him, at the fur, her lips parted, unable to form a question. What did he want? What was this? But then the wind howled again, a vicious, icy blast that cut right through her, and instinct took over. She took the pelt. She wrapped it tight around her child, tucking it in until only the baby's tiny face was visible. Still silent, the man lifted his eyes to meet hers, and in that quiet, steady look, she saw no judgment, no disgust, no pity. She saw only a question. Will you come? She didn't answer. She didn't have the strength to nod, but when he reached down with arms as thick as tree limbs, she didn't flinch. She let him lift her. His arms were as steady as stone, yet shockingly gentle. She found her cheek resting against the rough wool of his shirt, and suddenly, she began to cry. Not out of fear this time, but out of a relief so deep and overwhelming it felt like her bones were breaking all over again. He mounted his horse with an easy, fluid grace, holding her as if she were a sacred thing, something precious and fragile. She clutched her child close, the baby finally silent, finally warm in the deep fur. The man turned his horse, guiding it back the way he had come, away from the trail, away from the world that had cast her out. No words passed between them. The stars, as if on cue, finally began to break through the clouds. The trail to the settlement vanished into the shadows and pine trees behind them. Delaney didn't know where this silent stranger was taking her. She didn't know if he was a friend or something far more dangerous. She didn't know if this was salvation or just a different kind of ending. But her child was asleep now, and for the first time in hours, she no longer shivered. And as the horse's hooves beat a steady, rhythmic drum against the frozen earth, she closed her eyes and whispered the only prayer she had left. Let me live long enough to thank him. Because on that cold, hard trail of stones and silence, Delaney Grace was supposed to die. But instead, a man who didn't speak her language, a man the world had taught her to fear, had wrapped her child in fur, given her water, and was now carrying her toward a warmth she couldn't yet see. And she was beginning to understand that this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning. The horse moved like it was born of the mountains themselves. Each hoof found its place with a quiet, certain reverence, as though the stones whispered secrets to it. The world was bone cold, the kind of deep, biting cold that seeps into your marrow. Dawn was still just a pale rumor on the eastern horizon, and the man who carried her still did not speak. Delaney leaned her cheek against the fur of his coat, her arms wrapped protectively around her newborn daughter, who was a silent, warm bundle inside the mountain lion pelt. Beneath her ear, the man's heartbeat was a slow, steady drum. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of cedar, of earth, of solid, living strength. Every few moments, she would close her eyes and listen to it, just to convince herself this wasn't some fever dream. She'd once heard a preacher back home thunder from the pulpit that salvation would come with the blast of trumpets and the fury of angels. But for her, it had come with the soft tread of a horse's hooves and a stranger's profound, unshakable silence. The trail twisted through a sparse forest of piñon pines, their needles coated in frost, and then opened up into a wide ravine. A shallow creek trickled through it, its edges frozen into intricate, lacy patterns of ice. The man guided his horse across the creek without a single moment of hesitation. He knew this land. It was a part of him. She didn't ask where they were going. She couldn't have formed the words even if she'd wanted to. Her body was still a wreck, a hollowed-out and raw landscape of pain. Her head swam with exhaustion and the lingering fog of too many sleepless, terrified nights. But more than that, she didn't want to break the spell. The quiet between them wasn't empty or cold. It felt sacred. As the horse began to climb another steep hill, she studied him from the side. He was a massive man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as wagon beams. He sat straight and composed, with the kind of deep, ingrained discipline that comes from a life lived by a code she couldn't begin to imagine. He wore no badge, no soldier's blue coat, no shiny spurs. He was dressed in leather, bone, and a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. His braids, threaded with small, dull copper beads, and a single dark feather, rested against the solid muscle of his chest. Every gesture was calm. Every movement was unhurried. He had the presence of someone who didn't chase time, but who understood how to endure it, like winter. She didn't know his name, but in that moment, she trusted his silence more than she had ever trusted her father's sermons, her husband's vows, or the pious whispers of the church folk who had turned their backs on her. The child stirred in her arms, letting out a weak, mewling cry. Delaney shifted slightly, her arms tightening around her daughter's swaddled form. The man tilted his head just a fraction, not enough to look at her, but enough to show he was listening. "She's okay," Delaney whispered, her voice barely more than a puff of air. "Just hungry." He didn't reply, but she saw his fingers twitch almost imperceptibly on the horse's reins, then loosen again. It wasn't indifference, it was patience. It was the quiet understanding that some things were not his to fix, only to witness. A hawk shrieked high above them, its call echoing in the vast, cold emptiness. The wind rustled through the bare branches of a grove of cottonwood trees. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled once, a long, lonely note, and then was still. Delaney's thoughts drifted. She wondered if her baby would ever have a proper name. She hadn't chosen one. Back in the settlement, after her husband's death, She'd hidden the pregnancy under loose aprons and a wall of silence. No one had asked about the young widow in the corner house. Not after her husband was buried, and certainly not after the church ladies stopped their weekly visits. But when she started showing the first undeniable signs, the morning sickness, the softening of her waistline, they'd all known, and they'd all started whispering. They said the child was a punishment from God, a sin made flesh. They were wrong. She looked down at the baby's tiny, perfect fingers peeking out from the fur and whispered, "You're not a punishment. You're a beginning." They crested one final, snowy ridge, and suddenly, there it was, a small valley cupped between two towering, snow-dusted ridgelines, like a secret held in the palm of a giant's hand. At the base of a slope, nestled amongst ancient pines, sat a cabin. It was built from wide, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. A steady gray stream of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a silent promise of warmth. A simple corral stood off to the side, its gate slightly askew. There were no other homes, no other cabins, no other signs of life, and there were no footprints in the pristine snow except for the ones leading away from the cabin door and back again. The footprints of a single man. He swung down from the horse first, his movements fluid and sure. Then he turned and reached up for her. His arms cradled her carefully, allowing her to keep the baby wrapped tight and secure against her chest. She didn't flinch this time. Somehow, she knew she wouldn't fall. When he set her down on the small wooden porch, she swayed on her feet, a wave of dizziness washing over her. He steadied her with a firm hand beneath her elbow. The touch was simple, brief, but it carried more genuine kindness than any scripture she had ever heard. The cabin door opened with a low, welcoming creak. The warmth hit her first. It was like stepping into another world. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of wood smoke, old fur, and something savory stewing in a blackened pot over the fire. The room was simple. One large stone hearth dominated the far wall. A thick bearskin rug was spread on the floor. There was no cross on the wall, no Bible on a stand, no mirror to reflect her own ragged appearance. There were only hand-carved wooden bowls stacked neatly on a shelf, bundles of drying herbs hanging from the rafters, and a pile of soft, folded hides in a corner. He gestured toward a pallet of furs near the fire. She went to it without a word. He knelt beside her, unrolled 2 more furs to create a makeshift bed, and pulled a thick sheepskin blanket over them. When she tried to sit, her knees simply gave out, and she sank onto the pallet with a long, grateful, shuddering exhale. Her back burned, her hands were numb, her mind was a fog. Her child began to cry again, this time with a strength that surprised her. It was a hungry, demanding cry. She tried to nurse, her movements clumsy and weak. Nothing came. A cold knot of panic tightened in her stomach. The man knelt by the hearth and stirred the pot. After a moment, he stood, poured a ladle of what looked like warm goat's milk into a small wooden cup, and came to her side. There was no ceremony, no questions. He simply handed her the cup. Then he did something that stunned her. He slowly tore a thin, soft strip of hide, dipped it into the warm milk, and then, with incredible gentleness, he showed her how to let the baby suckle the life-giving drops from the leather. The child latched on, suckling weakly at first, then with more eagerness. Drop by drop, the milk disappeared. Drop by drop, the crying subsided. And that's when Delaney broke. Her shoulders began to shake, and silent, hot tears streamed down her cheeks, dripping onto the furs. It was a dam of grief and fear and exhaustion finally giving way. The man didn't react. He didn't pat her shoulder or offer empty words of comfort. He simply rose, stepped outside into the cold, and came back with a bowl packed with clean white snow. He set it beside the hearth to melt. It wasn't until she looked up again, her vision blurry with tears, that she realized he had been watching the child the entire time. Not her. He cared if the child lived. That was his focus. Something inside her, something that had been buried and frozen for months, began to shift. It was a tiny, fragile seed of trust. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and hoarse. He looked at her then, really looked at her. His face was still unreadable, a mask of stoic calm, but his amber eyes carried something she hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for a very, very long time. Recognition, as if she were a person. He didn't need to ask who she was or where she came from. The story was written all over her. In that moment, she was simply someone who was still alive, and for now, that was enough. That night, she curled up in the warm furs while he worked quietly on the other side of the small room. He sat by the fire, tanning a hide with practiced rhythmic motions. He sharpened a small curved blade on a whetstone. He smoked a narrow pipe carved from a deer antler, the smoke rising in a thin, fragrant wisp. When the baby cried, he looked up. When the baby calmed, he returned to his work. His presence was a constant, silent rhythm in the room. Delaney watched the shadows dance along the log walls. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. But for the first time, she no longer feared it. The storm had passed. Or maybe she had finally been brought in from it. After a long while, she found her voice again. "Delaney," she whispered into the quiet. His hands paused in their work. He looked at her across the flickering firelight. "My name," she clarified, her voice gaining a little strength. "It's Delaney Grace." A long moment passed between them, thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of the crackling fire. Then, in a voice that was low and sure, like the rumble of distant thunder, he said a single word. "Tawa." The way he said it wasn't a boast. It wasn't a name meant to intimidate or impress. It was just a fact, a truth, a name spoken into the firelight, as solid and real as the stone hearth itself. She repeated it under her breath, tasting the shape of it on her tongue. Tawa. It suited him. It was a name that sounded like it had been carved by wind and earth. A name that felt older than anger, older than judgment, older than the petty cruelties of the world she had left behind. Later, as she finally drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, her child nestled warm and safe at her side, she heard the sound of him tending the fire. And then she heard him whispering words in a language she didn't understand. It might have been a prayer. It might have been a song. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Some silences don't need to be broken, and some names don't need to be written in any book to be sacred. The fire was low but steady, burning a kind of wood that smelled faintly of juniper, sweet and clean when it cracked. Delaney watched its orange glow dance on the cabin's log walls, her baby sleeping soundly against her chest, tucked beneath the heavy warmth of the mountain lion pelt. She hadn't truly slept, not in the way a person is supposed to, but her body had stopped its violent trembling. The bone-deep chill was gone, and that, she thought, was something close to a miracle. Outside, the snow had started again, drifting down in a silent, hypnotic hush, blanketing the small valley in a profound stillness that she could feel deep in her ribs. Tawa moved as if he were part of that silence. He knelt by the hearth, feeding small pieces of wood into the embers, one by one. Every motion was deliberate, measured. There was no wasted energy, no sudden noise. His shadow, cast by the flickering flame and the pale morning light filtering through the cabin's single small window, stretched long and dark behind him. He hadn't spoken since he'd told her his name last night. She hadn't either. But the cabin didn't feel empty or cold because of it. The silence was full. Her daughter stirred, letting out a weak, contented cry, her tiny limbs flailing beneath the fur. Delaney adjusted her hold, her heart giving a little lurch of anxiety. She brought the baby to her breast and prayed. And this time, thank God, her body responded. The baby latched on with a soft, greedy sound. Delaney gasped, a sharp, sudden mingling of relief and pain. Her eyes welled with tears. It was working. She was working. She was a mother. She was keeping her child alive. She didn't realize she'd whispered the words "good girl" out loud until she saw Tawa look over his shoulder. His amber gaze met hers across the room. It wasn't a long look, not a heavy one. It was just a moment of connection. a moment of seeing. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That small acknowledgement felt more like a blessing than any prayer a preacher had ever said over her. When the baby was finished, full and milk-drunk, Delaney laid her down on the pallet beside her, swaddled and sleeping. She took a scrap of cloth and wiped herself clean, her hands still clumsy from exhaustion. She could feel the deep, radiating soreness in her hips, the bruised ache in her thighs. Her wrists ached. Her belly felt like it had been carved hollow. But her child lived, and she was warm, and she was fed. That alone was enough. Tawa brought her a bowl of something thick and steaming. It was a stew of beans, squash, and some kind of dark boiled meat. It smelled foreign to her, smoky and earthy, but it was warm, and her cold hands closed around the carved wooden bowl like it was a lifeline. She ate in slow, deliberate spoonfuls, too tired to be embarrassed by her hunger, too empty to pretend she had any pride left. When she finished, she set the bowl down. "Thank you," she said softly. He took the bowl from her, rinsed it with a scoop of snow that had melted in a pot by the fire, and set it back on the shelf. The simple, domestic act was so unexpected, it almost made her cry again. "You live here alone?" she asked, the question hanging in the quiet air. Tawa turned from the shelf to face her. His expression was still, unreadable. "Yes," he said. His voice was rough-edged, like rocks smoothed by a river, but quiet. She nodded, leaning her head back against the log wall, wincing at the movement. "How long?" He paused, thinking. Then he walked back to the fire and sat on the bearskin rug, stretching his long legs out toward the warmth. 5 winters. Not married? The question was out of her mouth before she could stop it. It was too personal, too forward. He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his profile etched in orange light. Then he said one word. "No." She looked at the lines etched around his mouth, at a thin, white scar that ran down his left forearm. It wasn't a scar from war, she guessed. It was a scar from work, from a life lived hard, from surviving things that no one else had seen. She tried not to pry, but the silence between them seemed to invite questions, to pull them out of her. "You got family?" she asked after another long while. "Far," he said. And the way he said it wasn't with sorrow, or anger, or longing. It was just a statement of fact. A door quietly closed. Delaney rubbed her palm down the length of her calf, watching the way the firelight illuminated the copper beads in his braids. He was younger than she'd first thought. Not a grizzled old man, but not a boy either. She guessed he was around 30, maybe a little more, younger than her late husband had been, but older than any man she had ever dared to speak to so freely. "I don't know what I would have done," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "if you hadn't found me." Tawa didn't respond, but she saw his broad shoulders shift just slightly, as if he were receiving her gratitude without needing to acknowledge it out loud. It mattered to him. She knew it did. She looked around the small one-room cabin again. Everything here was handcrafted. There was no table and chairs, but his tools, knives, awls, scrapers, hung neatly from wooden pegs on the wall. There was no glass mirror, but the smooth, polished inside of a large shell rested on a shelf, and it reflected the dancing firelight. There was no proper bed, only the pile of soft furs by the hearth. This wasn't just a house. It was a life. A life someone had built for themselves, piece by careful piece, without needing to explain it or justify it to anyone. "I used to think a house needed a roof and 4 walls," she murmured, mostly to herself, "and a clock on the wall, and pictures in frames." She gave a small, sad smile. "Turns out, all I really needed was someone who wasn't afraid to just sit in the silence with me." Tawa didn't smile, but she saw the hardness in his eyes soften, just for a moment. He stood up, crossed the room, and fetched a shallow bowl carved from horn. He set it near the fire and added fresh snow to it. Then he returned with a small leather pouch. He opened it, and the scent of dried herbs, Lavender, sage, and something else she didn't recognize, something sweet and earthy, filled the room. He steeped the herbs in the now warm water, stirring them slowly with a small stick. The scent was like a memory of a place she'd never been. "What's that for?" she asked. "For you," he said simply. He brought the bowl to her. She hesitated, then dipped a corner of a clean cloth into the warm, fragrant mixture. She wiped her face with it, her neck, the places that no one had touched with any gentleness in years. The scent was calming, grounding. She felt the tight knot of tension in her shoulders begin to sag. "You don't have to take care of me," she whispered, her voice thick. "I know," he said, and his tone was so simple, so direct, it was almost apologetic. She looked down at her own hands, at the dirt still lodged beneath her fingernails, the faint brownish stains of old blood on her knuckles. "I wasn't supposed to survive," she said quietly, the words tasting like ash. "They left me out there. I think they were hoping I'd die." He said nothing, but he didn't look away. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "My husband," she went on, the story tumbling out of her now. "He died 6 months after we were married. A fever took him. It took him before we could even say the word baby out loud." She swallowed hard. "His mama said I was cursed. She said the baby came too soon after he was gone. She said I must have—" She trailed off, unable to say the word. "It doesn't matter now." Tawa listened. He didn't listen like a man gathering facts for a judgment. He listened like someone holding a heavy weight in his hands without flinching, just to ease the burden for a moment. Delaney's eyes filled with tears again. "I thought if I just stayed quiet," she said, her voice breaking. "If I just endured it all, maybe God would see that I was trying to be good." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "But I think what I was really hoping for was that someone, anyone, would just see me." The fire crackled, a slow, soft sound that filled the sudden silence, and then Tawa finally spoke. His voice was low and certain. "I saw you." And with those 3 words, something inside her chest broke loose. It wasn't the kind of sob that shakes the body and wails into the air. It was a slow, silent weeping, her shoulders rising and falling with no sound, tears slipping down her face like prayers that had waited far too long to be answered. Tawa didn't reach for her. He didn't offer the kind of clumsy comfort a man gives when he's trying to fix something that's broken. He just stayed where he was, a silent guardian by the fire, and the stillness between them grew warmer, safer. The baby stirred again, and Delaney, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, reached for her instinctively. Tawa rose and added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up to greet it. "Does she have a name?" he asked, his back to her. Delaney paused. Her fingers gently stroked the baby's soft, downy hair. "Not yet," she said. He nodded once, as if that made perfect sense. He stepped outside into the swirling snow and came back with an armload of firewood. When he returned, he stamped the snow from his boots, then offered her a folded bundle. It was a piece of soft, clean cloth, freshly laundered. "For her," he said. Delaney took it, pressing the clean fabric to her face. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar and cold mountain wind. It smelled like safety. "Thank you," she said again. But this time, her voice held a new steadiness, a new strength. That night, Delaney did not sleep, but she did rest. And as she lay there on a bed of furs that weren't meant to be a bed, beneath a roof built by one man's hands, with the firelight dancing on walls that felt older than any story she could tell, Delaney began to feel something utterly foreign. It wasn't comfort, not exactly. It wasn't safety, not yet. It was the beginning of a kind of belonging she had never known before, a belonging that wasn't offered in sermons or forged by wedding rings. It was just a quiet place beside someone who had stayed when everyone else had turned away, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt like more than enough. By the middle of the week, the snow had begun to melt in soft, sun-warmed patches, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath the drifts. It was the slow, cautious stirring of a world coming back to life. A few small birds returned, quiet ones, gray and brown, hopping between the bare tree limbs as if they were afraid to sing too loudly, too soon. The stream behind the cabin had thawed just enough to begin its gentle, trickling song again. Delaney found herself standing beside it often, her baby pressed close to her chest in a sling Tawa had made for her. He had taken an old piece of soft buckskin and cut and sewn it with careful, precise stitches, creating a warm, secure pouch for the child. She was stronger now, not whole, but stronger. Her hips still sent a jolt of pain through her when she bent to gather kindling. Her hands, chapped from the cold, cracked and healed slowly. But every time her daughter cooed or grabbed for her finger with a surprisingly strong grip, or fell asleep to the quiet rhythm of her humming, she felt something deep inside her begin to rebalance. They still hadn't named the baby. Not properly. Tawa had said that names come when they are ready, when the child's spirit shows itself. Delaney liked that. It felt right. Let the child choose her own name, in her own time, with her own breath. Sometimes Delaney sang. Not loudly, not for show, the way she had in the church choir. These were small, humming ballads, little threads of half-remembered songs from her girlhood. She sang while she swept the cabin floor with a handmade broom. She sang while she ground dried corn between two smooth stones. She sang while she bathed the baby in a bowl of warm water, scented with the herbs Tawa had given her. It was during one of these quiet songs, her voice low and breathy like a lullaby whispered to the sky, that she looked up and saw him watching her. Tawa was standing by the small window, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his head tilted just slightly. He wasn't intruding. He wasn't evaluating her performance. He was just listening. And there was something about the way he looked at her, as if the sound of her voice meant something, as if it carried a weight and a history of its own, that made her throat tighten. No man had ever watched her sing without trying to make it about himself, about his pleasure, his pride, his ownership. But Tawa stood as still as the ancient pines outside, as if her voice was a fragile, sacred thing, worthy of his silence. She didn't stop singing. She just closed her eyes for a moment, and for the first time, she let herself believe it. I am safe here. The quiet between them grew fuller that week, not heavier, but fuller. It was now filled with unspoken understanding. Tawa started leaving her alone in the cabin for long stretches of the day. He would ride out before sunrise and return around midday, sometimes with fresh meat slung across his saddle, other times with bundles of roots wrapped in birch bark. He never said where he went, and she never asked. But she noticed the way his shoulders, which were always tense, seemed to relax just slightly when he stepped back through the door and saw her there, the baby on her hip, the fire tended, as if some part of him had worried she wouldn't be. Then, on the 7th morning, something changed. It came with the sound of hooves, multiple hooves, too many for comfort. Tawa heard them first. He was outside, splitting wood, and he froze mid-swing, the axe held aloft. He turned his head, listening, his body going rigid. He walked to the doorway of the cabin and stood in the frame, a silent, menacing shadow. Delaney, who was by the hearth, felt her own body go cold. Her heart, which had been beating so steadily for days, suddenly rose into her throat. Then came a voice, a loud, boorish voice, with a familiar drawl she hadn't heard in months, a voice she had prayed she would never hear again. Well, I'll be damned. Ain't that little Delaney Grace, playing house in the wilderness? She turned slowly, her blood turning to ice. 3 riders had come into the clearing, all settlers, all armed. One was the preacher from her old town, his collar crooked and stained around his thick neck. Another was a red-faced, thick-bellied man she didn't know, but he carried a shotgun held low and ready, and at the front of them, smirking beneath a sweat-stained, slouching hat, was Elias Kent, her late husband's cousin, her judge, her jury, and now, it seemed, her executioner. What in God's name are you doing out here with an engine? Elias said, swinging down from his horse and spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the clean snow. He got you working for him now? Or are you his squaw? Tawa didn't move a muscle. He was a statue carved from rock and fury. Delaney took a hesitant step forward, clutching the baby so tight the child let out a small whimper. You shouldn't be here, Elias. Elias laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the morning air. I should be wherever I please. This is still settler land, last I checked, not Red Man's charity. The preacher cleared his throat, his voice oozing a false sincerity. We came with concern, Miss Grace. Folks in town, well, they've been talking. Said they'd seen you out here. Said you might not be fit to raise a Christian child. Delaney felt her knees go hollow. I am fit, she said, her voice shaking. You gave birth in a ditch, Elias snapped, his face turning red. You left the Lord's care. You're shacked up with a savage. That baby don't stand a snowball's chance in hell with you. Tawa took one single step forward. Just one. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't speak a word. But the sheer menace in that one small movement was enough to make the fat man with the shotgun raise it, pointing it squarely at Tawa's chest. I wouldn't, Delaney said quickly, her voice sharp with sudden terror. The baby, sensing her fear, began to stir and fuss. Delaney's arms tightened. She's safe here, she said, her voice stronger now. And she is mine. She's illegitimate, Elias spat, his eyes full of a venomous glee. You're a woman unwed, underfed, and unwell. By law, you ain't got no claim to that child. Delaney's voice trembled with rage. You are not the law, Elias. No, the preacher said, stepping forward, a smug look on his face. But the town council is, and they're asking for a formal review of your situation. We'll be back for the child, Delaney, with the law on our side. They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a trail of fake apologies and thin, veiled threats hanging in the air behind them like foul smoke. When the sound of their hoofbeats finally faded into the trees, Delaney collapsed against the cold log wall of the cabin, her entire body shaking. Tawa walked to her side, but he didn't touch her. He just stood there, a silent, powerful presence. They'll come back, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Yes, he said. They want to take her from me. Yes. She looked up at him then, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading. Will you stop them? His amber eyes met hers, and they were as hard and clear as gemstones. If they try, he said, his voice a low growl. He paused, his gaze shifting toward the trail they had taken. But if they bring the law, if they bring more men... He looked back at her. Then we don't wait for them here. Delaney blinked. The meaning of his words sank in. Run. Again. She looked down at her baby, who had fallen asleep against her breast, oblivious to the storm that was gathering around them. A child born in the dirt, wrapped in a stranger's fur, and now hunted. Not because of anything she had done, but because her mother had dared to survive. Delaney took a long, slow breath and let it out. That evening, after she had bathed the child in a warmed bowl and dressed her in the soft, clean cloth Tawa had given them, she turned to him. He was sitting by the fire, sharpening a long, curved blade with slow, methodical strokes. They think I'm unfit, she said quietly, because I'm not married. Tawa didn't answer. He just continued to draw the blade across the whetstone. Shing, shing, shing. She hesitated, then said, I'd rather be alone for the rest of my life than belong to a man who sees me as less. He looked up from his work then, his eyes catching the firelight. You are not less. He paused, his hands still. You sing like the land remembers you. Delaney swallowed the hard knot that had formed in her throat. The simple, profound beauty of his words stole her breath. They'll come back, she said again, the fear returning. He nodded, his expression grim. He set the blade down and looked her straight in the eye. Let them, he said. And for the first time since her child was born, Delaney didn't feel like running. because for the first time in her life, she had found someone who was willing to stay. It began with smoke on the horizon, not the friendly single plume from a cabin chimney, but a dark, winding smudge against the pale blue morning sky. Tawa saw it first. He was standing just outside the cabin door, the packed snow crunching beneath his boots. He watched the dark trail rise from the distant pines, down in the direction of the settlement. It was the kind of smoke that comes from many fires, bunched together, clustered in a way that meant only one thing. The town was waking up, and it wasn't waking kindly. Inside, Delaney was swaddling her daughter. The baby was 3 weeks old now, and she was thriving. Her cheeks were pink and full, her eyes bright and curious. She cooed when the morning light from the small window touched her face, her tiny, perfect fingers reaching out as if she wanted to catch the sunbeams. Delaney smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, as she traced a gentle line along the baby's forehead. This child had become her compass, her breath, the living, breathing proof that something beautiful could not only survive ruin, but grow out of it. She looked up as Tawa stepped silently through the doorway. His face was a mask of grim certainty. "They're coming," he said. The words were simple, flat. There was no need to ask who they were. She nodded, her smile vanishing. They had known this was coming. Ever since Elias and his posse had ridden off, muttering their threats wrapped in scripture, the air had felt different, heavy, tense. Tawa had prepared. In the days since their visit, he had sharpened every tool, cleaned every fur, and packed a small leather pouch with dried meat, healing herbs, and flint. Delaney had readied what little she could: a precious bottle of goat's milk, extra cloth for diapers, the buckskin sling for the child. But now, faced with the stark reality of it, her knees still trembled. Tawa moved to her side, his presence a solid wall of calm. His gaze was level, his voice steady. "If we leave now," he said, "we have time. We can reach the river canyon before they reach this valley." She looked down at her daughter, so small, so innocent. Then she looked out the window, toward that ominous, distant line of smoke. She thought of a life on the run, of hiding in canyons, of always looking over her shoulder. And then she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm tired of running." Tawa watched her for a long, silent moment. She could see a dozen emotions flicker in his amber eyes: concern, respect, maybe even fear. But when he spoke, his voice held nothing but resolve. "Then we stay." It wasn't said with rage. It wasn't said with pride. It was the quiet, unshakable decision of a man who has faced too many storms to be afraid of another one. She packed the rest of their meager supplies anyway, just in case. But when the time came, she didn't move toward the back of the cabin, toward escape. She stood in the very center of that small, sturdy room, the firelight warm on her face, her daughter held tight in her arms, and she waited. They heard the wagons before they saw them, the groan and creak of wooden wheels, the jingle of harnesses, the clatter of many hooves on the rocky trail, and beneath it all, a distant angry murmur of voices. Dozens of them. Then the first man on horseback crested the hill, then a second, and then, by the time the full crowd came into view, spilling into the pristine valley like a dark stain, Delaney's breath caught in her throat. It was the entire town. Men with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, women in their stiff Sunday best, their faces pinched with judgment, their stares like daggers. Even children, their eyes wide and confused, peered out from the back of wagon benches. The town sheriff rode at the front of the procession, a long-barreled shotgun resting across his lap. And just behind him, riding tall in his saddle, was Elias Kent. His face was puffed up with a smug, triumphant confidence. He looked like a man who had already won. Delaney took a deep breath, opened the cabin door, and stepped out onto the porch. She held the baby close, her chin held high. Tawa stood beside her, his arms crossed over his chest, as unmoving and silent as the mountain itself. The sheriff raised a hand, and the noisy crowd fell silent. "We're here for the child, Delaney," he called out, his voice echoing in the cold air. Delaney's heart slammed against her ribs. "She's mine," she called back, her voice shaking but clear. Elias spurred his horse forward a few steps. "You forfeited that claim when you chose this savage over your own people," he yelled. Tawa took a single deliberate step forward, moving to the edge of the porch. "Back off, Tawa," the sheriff warned, his hand tightening on his shotgun. "This ain't about race. It's about what's right, and that child deserves a proper Christian home." Delaney laughed then. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was a raw, broken sound of utter disbelief. Her voice cracked with it. "Proper?" she cried out, her voice ringing across the snow. "A proper home? From the town that left me to die in a ditch? From the people who turned their backs and locked their doors?" The sheriff didn't answer. He just stared at her, his face grim. "I bled alone!" she shouted, her voice gaining strength from her fury. "I prayed alone. I fed her from a body that hadn't eaten in days. And then he found me. He carried me. He kept us alive. Not one of you even came looking." "He seduced you," Elias snapped, his face turning a blotchy red. "He took advantage of you, made you think you had no other choice." "He didn't seduce me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense calm. "He saved me." The baby, startled by the shouting, began to cry. Delaney shifted her hold, rocking the infant gently, never taking her eyes off the crowd. Elias dismounted from his horse. "Enough of this talk. Sheriff, get the child." But just as the sheriff raised his hand to signal his men, Tawa moved. He didn't make a sound. He was off the porch and across the snow-covered ground in 2 long, silent strides. He moved with a speed that was both terrifying and beautiful. He stood between Delaney and the crowd, a tall, immovable sentinel. The trees themselves could have sent him. "She stays," he said, and his voice was not a request. It was a statement of absolute fact. "Are you threatening the law, son?" the sheriff asked, his eyes narrowing. "No," Tawa said, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion that made every man in the crowd flinch, he gently unsheathed the long, curved blade from his belt. The polished steel caught the morning sun. "But I will not kneel to it." The moment cracked open. The preacher gasped. A woman in the crowd let out a short scream. 2 of the men nervously raised their rifles. Delaney stepped off the porch, her heart pounding in her ears. "No!" she cried out. "Stop!" Tawa didn't move. His stance was purely protective, not aggressive, but there was not a single person in that crowd who doubted he could kill 3 men before a bullet ever reached him. She moved to stand in front of him, placing herself between his blade and the town's guns. "She stays with me," she said again, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "But not because of him, because of me. I am not unfit, I am not unworthy. I am a mother, and that should be enough." The sheriff studied her, his gaze flicking from her determined face to the crying child in her arms. "And what if it's not enough, Delaney?" She looked past him, at the faces in the crowd. Faces she had known her whole life, faces that had smiled at her in church and then whispered about her in the street. "Then do what you came to do," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, absolute. A decision waited there, hanging in the cold morning air, a thing with a weight and a life of its own. And then something shifted. A voice rang out from the back of the crowd. It was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hand holding the small hand of a young child. "I saw her," the old woman said, her voice thin but clear, when she thought no one was watching. "I saw her sing to that baby like she was stitched right to her heart." Another voice followed, this one from a burly farmer. "I brought her food once, after her husband passed. She shared half of it with the stable boy." "I saw her down at the creek," a third voice added, a young woman. "She was talking to her child, like a mother, not like a sinner." The tide was turning. Delaney blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. A murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of doubt, of shifting allegiance. Elias, seeing his power slipping away, spat on the ground. "You're all fools! Sentimental old women! She's a whore who laid down with an animal!" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Tawa moved so fast the snow barely stirred beneath his feet. In an instant, he had closed the distance, grabbed Elias by the front of his coat, and lifted him effortlessly off the ground with one hand. He slammed him hard against the side of a wagon, the wood groaning in protest. Rifles were raised again, but the sheriff didn't move. He just watched. Tawa's face was inches from Elias's. His voice was a low, level, and deadly whisper that carried across the clearing. "She gave life," he growled, "while you gave only stones." Elias, his face red and sputtering, couldn't form a single word. Tawa held him there for a long, terrifying moment, and then, with a look of utter contempt, he simply dropped him in a heap in the snow. The sheriff took a long look at Delaney, then at the sleeping child, then at the frightened, uncertain faces of his townsfolk. And then he looked at Tawa, who now stood guard over a whimpering, defeated Elias. He lowered his shotgun. "She stays," he said, his voice loud and final. The tension that had gripped the valley for what felt like an eternity finally broke, shattering like glass. Elias roared with impotent rage, but no one followed his lead. The crowd began to turn, to disperse one by one, wagon by wagon, like a foul wind losing its strength. They shuffled away, their eyes downcast, their rifles now held loosely at their sides. Delaney stood frozen, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. She looked at Tawa. He met her gaze and gave a single slow nod as if to say, "It's done." But she knew it wasn't really done, not fully. The whispers would follow them, the sideways looks, the judgment. But something important had shifted, something had held. They had faced the storm together, and they had not broken. That night, long after the last wagon had vanished back into the trees, after the baby was asleep and the fire crackled with a steady, peaceful rhythm, Delaney sat beside Tawa on the bearskin rug. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed his wrist. Slowly, carefully, she turned his large, calloused hand over and placed her own small hand in his. "You never asked me to stay," she whispered. Tawa looked at her, and his eyes, in the soft firelight, were as gentle as the falling snow outside. "I did not want you to feel owned," he said, his voice a low rumble. A real smile, the first one in a year, touched her lips. "You didn't make me feel owned," she said. "You made me feel seen." Silence fell between them again, comfortable and deep. "I want to stay," she said, her voice clear and sure. He didn't respond at first. He just looked at her hand resting in his. Then slowly he turned his palm and laced his strong fingers with hers. "No more running," she said. "No," he agreed, his grip tightening just slightly around her hand. "We build. Here." They sat that way for a long time, two quiet souls with wounds still fresh, but finally beginning to heal, the fire warming their intertwined hands and casting their joined shadow on the wall behind them. Outside, the wind sang a low, gentle song through the pines. Inside, their daughter shifted in her sleep and smiled. In that moment, something sacred settled over the small cabin. It wasn't loud or grand. It was a quiet, unassuming kind of forever. The town had come to cast stones, but one man had carried her through the storm. And in doing so, he had taught her the only kind of love that ever truly mattered. The kind that doesn't run, the kind that sees, the kind that stays. If you were moved by the story of Delaney and Tawa and their fight for a family, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming up next.